Hello, everyone. Welcome to another brief lecture for Philosophy 101. This is part 2 of the Reasons to Believe part of Philosophy of Religion. And we had discovered in the last, or discussed in the last lecture, the two major a posteriori arguments for God's existence, the cosmological and the teleological. And now we want to talk about a lesser known but still historically important argument for God's existence called the ontological argument. This has been given by a number of very famous philosophers, Anselm, Rene Descartes, Gottfried Leibniz, and others, and then some objections. Okay, so there's a general pattern of ontological argumentation for God's existence that usually goes something like this. So I'll give another way of describing it before getting into the formalized argument. So one way to think about ontological arguments is to think about where the concepts of perfection and greatest possible being come from. And the inference is that we wouldn't have those concepts if there wasn't something that actually had those concepts. So in other words, we can use reason, our human reasoning processes, and one might argue God-given reasoning processes, to conclude that there must be something that corresponds to that. So maybe we're thinking of correspondence theory as well. So the argument goes something like this. God, by definition, is the greatest being possible. So what do we mean by that? Well, proponents say there can't be anything greater than God. Premise 2, suppose the greatest possible being exists only in the understanding, in the mind as a mental object. So suppose for a moment that God, or the idea of God, only exists in our minds and nowhere else. Premise 3, then a greater being than the greatest being possible can be conceived, one existing not just in the understanding, but also in reality. For a being is greater if it exists in reality than if it exists only in the understanding. So from this move, I know premise 3 might seem slightly complicated, but the move is very interesting, very ingenious here. So the proponents say this yields a contradiction, for a being greater than the greatest being possible is impossible. Therefore, God, the greatest being possible, must exist in reality, not just in the understanding. So the really interesting move, as I say, is in premise 3, because this is the move where the proponent of the ontological argument says that this can't happen. There can't be a being, we can't imagine a being greater than God, right? And so from that is the conclusion that God must exist in reality and not just in the understanding alone. So if that seems a little complicated, this argument has been less, how should we say, successful perhaps than the cosmological and teleological arguments for some pretty perhaps obvious reasons. One was given by a fellow theist and contemporary of Anselm, which is essentially, well, if this reasoning is good, we could prove just about anything, right? Like the greatest possible island. So Guanilo, who was a contemporary of Anselm, said, if we can imagine the greatest possible island, then, right, we could show that that island must exist not only in the understanding, but also in reality. But that seems absurd, right? So that's one possible objection that immediately comes to mind. Anselm responds to this by essentially saying, look, I'm referring to God, not islands. But Guanilo says, but now your argument begs the question. You've assumed God exists in your argument, then shown that you've proved his existence. This is circular reasoning. You've already assumed that God exists and is not equivalent to things like islands. So you've essentially proved the thing that you've assumed. And that's not good reasoning. So Guanilo, who is a theist, doesn't think this kind of argument for God is going to work. This argument was also attacked very famously by Immanuel Kant, who also himself was a theist. So you can criticize these arguments and still be a theist. We should point that out. Kant famously says, existence is not a predicate. In other words, existence is not a property of God. So we don't say, right, God exists, like God has the property of existence. We just say God is. So we don't have to qualify God by saying God exists. So existence is not a predicate of God, Immanuel Kant famously said. He's not saying God doesn't exist. He's saying it's almost a tautology to say that God exists. And then God has existence is a redundancy. We don't ascribe existence as a predicate to things. Why is existence even a thing that comes in degrees, right? So part of Anselm's move, as we saw in the previous slide, is to say that, there is a green greater than which nothing else can be imagined. Well, then that seems to imply that existence is a thing that comes in degrees, right? Which many of us think isn't the case. Either things exist or they don't. Also, there's a problem with premise 2. Why suppose that a being exists only in the understanding? This leads to the contradiction that Anselm is after, but critics charge, if Anselm means the concept of the greatest being possible, then we wouldn't get any contradiction, and Anselm's argument doesn't go through, right? So if by that Anselm means the concept of the greatest island possible, then there's no contradiction, right? So many people think that Anselm is being somewhat heavy-handed with how he uses this contradiction method in the argumentation. So suffice it to say, I think the ontological argument hasn't enjoyed the same level of success in convincing other people as the previous aforementioned arguments, cosmological and teleological, but some very famous philosophers who were theists have advanced a version of this argument. So the article also mentions what's called reformed epistemology. And this goes back to our section on epistemology. So Alvin Plantinga is a contemporary philosopher of religion. He's very well known. I've actually met him a few times. He is a very nice man, a very well known philosopher at he was at Notre Dame for forever, very good school. And he gave this argument for God as being properly basic. And I'll explain what he means by that. We have to look at our basic beliefs and what we mean by the proposition God exists. Okay. So one way to focus on philosophy of religion is to focus on the de facto question that we started with whether or not the proposition is true that God exists. That seems to be the obvious way that we start philosophy of religion. And then from that, we could produce metaphysical arguments for God's existence in response to that question, which we just saw, the cosmological, the teleological, and the ontological. But these have obviously not met with widespread success. Many philosophers have rejected these arguments, even, again, theists, as not being successful. So instead, what Plantinga and others try to do is shift the focus to a different kind of question, whether or not belief in the proposition or in God is rational. Oops. So from that, the production of epistemological arguments for rational, justified, and warranted belief in God, even despite a lack of evidence, are a response to this. So this is going to be where we're going to see the arguments go from now. Instead of giving us arguments for God's existence, instead we're talking about whether belief in God is rational and justified. And that's what Plantinga and others think should be the proper approach to God's existence. So here's Plantinga. This is an older photo. I met him about, 11 or 12 years ago. He's an actual friend of my former advisor. So just a quick aside, but well-known philosopher of religion. I think he's still alive. I haven't actually checked, but he's got to be pretty old now. 1932. He's made a lot of significant contributions to philosophy of religion, epistemology, metaphysics, and Christian apologetics. So he is Christian. And he developed this reformed epistemology, which, as I said, attempts to show the rationality of theistic belief without appeal to evidence. So we'll see that in other arguments for God's existence that don't try to rely on evidence, but rather belief in God. Okay, so remember, we talked about epistemology. And so the claim is that the traditional rejection of theistic belief as irrational, that people shouldn't believe in God, rests on two assumptions. One view that we've talked about called evidentialism, which is the view that beliefs require evidence, right? So if I'm going to believe in a flying spaghetti monster, I need some evidence for a flying spaghetti monster. But there's also this view called foundationalism, which we also briefly talked about with Descartes. We hinted at. So according to foundationalism, while some beliefs are justified by resting on the support of other justified beliefs, other, what we would call basic beliefs, are just justified in and of themselves in certain circumstances and conditions. Both aim to avoid an infinite regress of justification being required by identifying appropriate stopping or starting points, either evidence or basic belief. So you already know how Descartes does this, right? The first starting point is if I think I exist. And that is in many respects a basic belief. You don't need evidence, right? Descartes thinks that we use reason to talk about that foundation for knowledge. So similarly, Plantinga is going to talk about maybe another basic belief, and you guessed it, it's about God. So beliefs about God are either arrived at by inference or argument, or two, in a more immediate way, in which case they are not accepted on the evidential basis of other propositions. So the cosmological, teleological, and ontological arguments, as the name implies, try to arrive at God's existence by trying to show us to accept a conclusion based on some evidence or some reasons. But Plantinga wants to say we don't even need to be in that game. Belief in God is just properly basic. It's more of an immediate arrival at something that we can know without any need for evidence. Okay, so as I said, what Plantinga and others who accept this approach, what they mean by proper basicality is immediate non-inferential beliefs. Those are the kind of beliefs that are called basic. If they're also self-justifying, which would be determined by some specified criteria, then we call them properly basic beliefs. So here's an example. I ate a Nutri-Grain bar for breakfast this morning, okay? This counts as a properly basic belief if it meets Plantinga's criteria for justification. That is, it was produced by properly functioning cognitive faculties like my eyes and my brain. So that's a properly basic belief, according to Plantinga, because it was formed by properly functioning cognitive faculties like my eyes and my brain. I don't need to rely on evidence for that belief. I just rely on my faculties to arrive at that belief. So what does all of this have to do with faith in God's existence? Well, Plantinga argues if belief in the existence of God is properly basic, then it is rational to accept that belief without evidence, proof, or argument in God, right? So here's an overview of this argument that Plantinga gives. Premise one, if it is epistemically possible for belief in the existence of God to meet the conditions for proper basicality, then it is rational to accept that belief without evidence, proof, or argument. On this model, beliefs about God are produced by a faculty known as, and this is what Plantinga calls it, sensus divinitatis. So this he gets from Calvin and other Christians who think that we have almost like uh, a spark from God to believe in God, that we've been almost imprinted with this notion that we can reach God from God himself. So if it's epistemically possible that this model is true, then it's rational to believe in the existence of God without evidence, proof, or argument. It is epistemically possible that this model or something like it is true. Therefore, it's rational to believe in the existence of God without evidence, proof, or argument. So this has been a very interesting argument that has influenced philosophy of religion for the last 40 or so years. Obviously, if you're an evidentialist, you're not going to accept this. So what are some objections to this kind of route to God? Well, one is Plantinga's argument rests on that distinction that I talked about right at the beginning between de jure and de facto questions. In other words, he thinks his argument for rational belief in God without evidence, proof, or argument does not presume that God exists. But like the ontological argument, right, some people say, however, since God's existence is necessary for the argument to work, it seems like he is assuming that God exists, right? Similar to how Anselm was trying to argue. You assume God exists and then say that I've proved that God exists. But how is this any better than the moves that Anselm makes, right? That's one objection. Additionally, if Plantinga's argument works for rational belief in a monotheistic conception of God, then it also works for pretty much any other conception of the divine, right? So for example, swap God for the flying spaghetti monster and sensus divinitatis for something like sensus marinaris, right? I mean, I'm Italian. So like Ganilo with the perfect island example, I mean, it seems like we could just say that a belief in the flying spaghetti monster is properly basic, but that seems weird, right? Then it would be rational to believe in the existence of the flying spaghetti monster without evidence, proof, or argument. Interestingly, Plantinga responds to this similar to Anselm. He thinks, no, it doesn't work for flying spaghetti monsters because, right, God is of a different type. A lot of people don't find that very convincing, but nonetheless, a lot of people do think that Plantinga has come up with a new, interesting way to talk about belief in God as being rational, right? Without any appeal to argument or evidence. So let me leave it there. There's a lot of interesting questions that I'm sure we'll have to pass over, but this concludes the lecture on standard reasons for belief in God's existence.